Hello, welcome everyone. On behalf of the Rockefeller Center for Public Policy and the Social Sciences, thank you for joining us today, both here in person and on the live stream. My name is Bea Burak. I'm a 25 or a junior here at Dartmouth. I'm from New Hampshire and I'm studying history and government. And I want to give a really special thanks to our guest speaker, Tim Mulvey, for joining us and generously sharing his time with our students and community today. Mr. Mulvey got to Hanover this afternoon, and he's already visited a Dartmouth class, and he'll be spending dinner with a group of students. So we're really thankful for all the opportunities he's giving us to learn from him and engage him in conversation. For this evening's program, Mr. Mulvey will be joined in conversation by Professor Kristen Ammerling, who is teaching a spring term course on congressional investigations. Professor Ammerling is a congressional oversight expert who served in senior counsel positions on congressional committees and in the executive branch. And she's been chief counsel to 3 committees in the House of Representatives. Most recently, she was chief counsel and deputy staff director for the House Select Committee to investigate the January 6th attack on the United States Capitol. She also directed oversight and investigations for the Senate Commerce, Science, and Transportation Committee, and served as deputy general counsel at the Department of Transportation. Professor Ammerling is a graduate of Harvard College and the University of California, Berkeley School of Law. Our guest speaker today, Tim Mulvey, is a seasoned communications strategist who served in government for more than 15 years, both on Capitol Hill and in the executive branch. And Mr. Mulvey played a leading role in shaping strategy and messaging for some of the most high-profile oversight and foreign affairs matters in recent years. In his most recent government role, he was communications director for the House Select Committee to investigate the January 6th attack. And that means he's managed all public-facing aspects of the committee's work. He was a senior strategic advisor to the committee's bipartisan membership and a key architect of the committee's final report and of the public hearings, which many of you may have tuned into on TV. Before that, Mr. Mulvey was the longtime communications director for the Democratic staff of the House Committee on Foreign Affairs. And during the Obama administration, he worked in the State Department as a speechwriter for Secretaries of State Clinton and Kerry. Mr. Mulvey now advises clients on complex strategic communications matters as an associate partner at Denton's Global Advisors. He lives in Washington, D.C. with his wife and daughter. And we look forward to this conversation between Mr. Mulvey and Professor Ammerling. And towards the end of the conversation, we're going to also welcome audience Q&A. So when we get to that part of the program, if you're here in person with us, we'll have a mic available for you. And for our online audience, you can submit your questions by emailing rockyqa@dartmouth.edu. So thank you, everyone, again for joining us this evening, and please join me in welcoming Tim Mulvey and Professor Kristen Ammerling to the stage.
Good afternoon. Tim, I am thrilled to join the Dartmouth community in welcoming you to campus. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us.
Thank you, Kristen. Thank you, Bea, for the lovely introduction, and thanks to the Rockefeller Center in Dartmouth for having me to your beautiful campus, and I think we're going to have a nice chat.
I am looking forward to it. Now, you have held a variety of high-level government communications positions. And in this conversation, I want to cover challenges you faced, both in the executive branch and in your work in Congress. But I'd like to kick things off by focusing on an experience that you and I shared, which was service on the House Select Committee to investigate the January 6th attack on the United States Capitol. So let me bring you back to the very early days of the investigation. You and I both came on as 2 of the first 5 staff hired by the committee shortly after it was established in the summer of 2021. And we came on, I think, within a day of each other, and I know we came on when there was just 1 week between our start date and when the committee was putting on its very first public hearing. And I have very strong memories of those first few days. We were operating off borrowed desks in the back of someone else's office space as we were scouting out permanent office space for the staff that had not yet been hired. We were starting interviews of staff. all while we were full bore preparing for this first hearing with the members. And I'm interested in hearing from you. What is your strongest memory of those first few days?
There are a lot of strong memories. First of all, when I was offered the job as communications director for the select committee, I'm thinking of this in terms of Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday. The hearing was on Tuesday. And I interviewed for the job on Wednesday afternoon. On Wednesday evening, I was told, congratulations, you got the job. Now, I'd worked on Capitol Hill for more than a decade, and when you work on Capitol Hill, you kind of plan your personal life around the rhythms of Congress. You're in session or you're in recess, and so vacation always had to happen in recess, which generally is in August. This year, I was not working in Congress. I'd wrapped up my previous job on the Hill, so my wife and I made plans to go on vacation a week earlier, the last week of July. And we were leaving that Saturday, and the person who called and offered me the job knew about this and said, remind me when you're going on vacation. I said, Saturday. He said, great, you start Friday, come pick up your laptop and phone, and by the way, there's a hearing Tuesday, you need to be back for it. So I did that. I went and collected my phone and laptop. I can't remember if I saw you that day or talked on the phone later that day. But there was this incredible urgency for the Select Committee to hit the ground running with its bipartisan membership. After 6 months of a lot of debate about how the insurrection on January 6th was going to be investigated, and what had originally been sort of a unified focus on finding answers had predictably, sadly, broken down largely along partisan lines, and there had been, at that point, an effort to whitewash what had happened and to say, well, what you all saw in those days with your own eyes, you shouldn't believe. It wasn't actually an insurrection. It was a regular tourist visit at the Capitol or whatever. So there was this urgency driven by our chairman, Benny Thompson, who's a remarkable member of Congress from serves Mississippi's 2nd District, to remind people right away of what had happened. And that's really what that first hearing did. We had these 4 police officers, Capitol Police officers, Metropolitan Police Department officers from Washington, D.C., who testified in uniform, recounting what happened to them that day, paired with this absolutely harrowing footage from their own body cameras, from surveillance video, from what we saw on the news, from what documentary videographers had recorded, which really did remind people of just the brutality of the attack that day, and I think struck a really important note in underscoring the importance of the Select Committee's work, because we were already under attack from political enemies who wanted to discredit the Select Committee from right off the bat. So striking that serious note, reminding people of what had happened, showing the serious purpose of the chairman, of all of the members, Republicans and Democrats, to get to the bottom of what happened was hugely important. We really couldn't afford to swing and miss, and we didn't. And it was this remarkable all hands on deck effort with staff borrowed from other committees who came together to put together this remarkable hearing on this Tuesday in July in the Homeland Security hearing room. And in that room, it was just rapt attention, listening to the testimony of these witnesses, watching the video, hearing from the members. And then it was over, and Kristen and I kind of looked at each other like, okay, well, what do we do now? Because we were pretty much standing alone in a room, and everybody else had gone back to their committees, and it was really from there that the ball started rolling in terms of the investigation.
And that was the end of July 2021, and really after that, the committee went behind closed doors for about 11 months and started focusing on the day-to-day work of gathering information.
That's right, and we had to build a team, we had to conduct an investigation, and we had throughout that time to keep the attention of the public and the press focused on what we were doing. From a communications perspective, it was an interesting challenge. I had been in a new office before, I had worked in a committee before, I had worked on a high-profile investigation before. I'd never done all 3 at the same time. And for an investigation like this, as Kristen says, something like this does need to be conducted behind closed doors. A serious investigation is not a show trial. It's not something where you're holding hearings for the sake of holding hearings to try to score political points. The Select Committee built a staff of dozens and dozens of seasoned investigators, former U.S. attorneys, people who had worked for the Justice Department. And we're going to do the work that was necessary to fulfill the Select Committee's mission, which was to provide an accounting of the facts, circumstances, and causes of the January 6th attack. For a communications person, that kind of left me scratching my head like, okay, but what are we going to say? So one of the challenges across those 11 months was, how do we demonstrate that we're making progress? How do we demonstrate that we're a serious investigation? How do we demonstrate that our naysayers were mistaken in terms of what we could accomplish in that time? And how do we get ready, ultimately, to tell that story? And some of this was learning on the ground as things went forward. And there are tools in the communication toolkit that are important for an investigation. When we announce the witnesses we're subpoenaing, it shines a spotlight on those individuals and can apply pressure to encourage them to cooperate for an investigation, particularly when we had the chair and vice chair be able to say, we hope these 4 individuals that we're subpoenaing today will join these many other witnesses and help us get to the facts of what happened on January 6th. It also is an indication to the press when we're under intense scrutiny that we're moving along, that we're making progress, that we're taking serious action. Along the way, I discovered, and the committee discovered, that there emerged other opportunities to show the progress we were making. And part of this is because, for one instance, the Select Committee got sued how many times?
At least 30
we got
cases
sued
were
30
pending.
times. So we ended up being in litigation quite a bit, but through that process, as part of the litigation, when the Select Committee would make filings, part and parcel to that was including evidence. So we would be making filings in federal court, which included pages of transcripts that people had never seen before. They included evidence that we had gathered, which of course was important for the Select Committee making its case before the courts, but also the press and the public could page through this and say, oh my goodness, I didn't realize they had talked to this former White House official. I didn't realize they had talked to this former Pentagon official. I didn't realize they had learned this. I didn't realize that this witness had turned over these emails. So we had these moments over those 11 months where we could sort of send up a signal saying, yeah, we're getting a lot of information here. You know, we were fortunate that we were able to keep most of our important information until we chose to present it, largely over the summer hearings in 2022. But throughout that time, between the court filings, between the contempt proceedings, when the handful of recalcitrant witnesses who totally stonewalled the Select Committee were cited for contempt of Congress, those were other opportunities as we prepared these reports to show the paper trail, the correspondence between the Select Committee and those witnesses' attorneys and other pieces of evidence. So,
And how did you approach those proceedings from a communications perspective?
well, it's interesting because both in terms of the court filings and in the contempt proceedings, those are pretty belts and suspenders sort of processes where the House must adopt a resolution, the committee must adopt a resolution that details this, and then it comes to a vote for the House. But from a communications perspective, you don't let that opportunity go to waste when you have an appendix of 55 pages of new information. This is part of the sort of the traditional media relations playbook where that this is going to be scrutinized and you're working with the press who covered us. And largely, I just want to say as an aside, the media who covered the Select Committee did a thorough and substantive job. They were fair, they were interested in the facts, they were circumspect in how they treated the politics. Any communications director is going to spend a lot of time in going back and forth with media about stuff they're not terribly crazy about, but overall they did a great job. And when we did have, these things popped up, we took advantage of it from a communications perspective. Our contempt proceedings were relatively quick. We would do them in the evenings after members had come back into town. We would use them to highlight particular pieces of evidence related to whoever the witness was who decided not to cooperate. Generally, I think the press came away with it with the understanding, we're very serious about this investigation, and we will do what's required and use whatever authorities we have when it comes to witnesses who want to defy the law, want to defy a subpoena and not cooperate. And secondly, there was a part of it that was, we're getting this information under any circumstances. We would like to know what you know, whoever the given witness was who wasn't cooperating, but we know you're involved because this information we got from this other witness points to it. So that really helped, I think, lay a firm foundation for us in the run-up to when we were really ready to present all of that information as a beginning, middle, and end of the story.
So that's a nice segue to the summer of 2022, when the committee had reached the point where they had initial findings as they continued to gather evidence. And they reached the decision that they wanted to present the initial findings in a series of 8 hearings. Can you talk about the communication challenges that you were thinking through about presenting the information in those hearings, and how is it different from what you thought about for the very first hearing?
Well, for the very first hearing, again, I think the key part of that was reminding the public about really what they already knew, and that had maybe faded from memory a bit in the 6 months. The summer 2022 series of hearings was a much bigger challenge because that was the moment that we had to show whether the select committee had done its job, whether we were credible, whether the body of evidence we had gathered said what we said it was going to demonstrate. And presenting that kind of information to the audience we wanted to reach was, in my mind, the biggest challenge I've ever grappled with as a communications professional. I've worked on hundreds of congressional hearings, as you have, and it's tough to break through to an audience beyond those who are paying specific attention to whatever it is you're working on. But at the same time, with the select committee, we had a bit of a perfect storm in the way we could present this information, using sort of the traditional tools that we use in hearings on Capitol Hill, but bringing more sophisticated use of multimedia into our presentation. We knew at the outset, again, that we were going to have a lot of compelling visual evidence to remind people of what happened on January 6th. As the investigation went along, a lot of the story ended up being told by the witnesses on camera, in interviews and depositions. And a lot of these individuals were household names. And so as we approached the hearings, traditionally you have members sitting at the dais and you have witnesses sitting at the witness table. And occasionally you have some multimedia that goes up. But the way we thought about these is that we brought a third narrator into it. We had the members, we had the witnesses, and then we had this enormous mountain of multimedia information that we were able to use so that the members guided the story, but it was the witnesses who ended up really telling the story in their own words. And it created this storytelling opportunity that, and all the time I'd been on the Hill, many hearings that I worked on, I'd never sort of been able to put together, and maybe even hadn't even thought of it. And our members had the great idea of saying, Why are we video recording our witnesses when they're sitting down for depositions and interviews? We should be. We want to hear from them directly. And all of that taken together still relied on, well, are the facts there? And our investigators did just a superb job, dozens of attorneys and our members as well, who were deeply, directly engaged on a day-to-day basis with the investigation. A superb job of building this universe of evidence and then sifting through it and figuring out what are the most relevant details, what is the story that emerges from this, and then working with an incredibly talented team of communications professionals and producers and editors who worked for me, and again, with the collaboration with the members of putting together these 90-minute, 2-hour segments, each of which represented a different part of the story we wanted to tell. But even if you have all that confidence, even if you've done all that work and have all that talent and have all that material, it's still a bit of a crapshoot when you go out there and wonder whether people are going to react to it. And I can remember June 9th, 2022, it was a Thursday evening. We were standing in the anteroom of the Cannon Caucus Room, now the Speaker Nancy Pelosi Caucus Room in the Cannon House office building. And a minute past 8 is when the doors had to open, which itself is a bit of an oddity. Usually a hearing starts when the chairman or chairwoman walks in and sits down and bangs the gavel. That's when a hearing starts. These hearings had to start precisely on time. We were on every network. We were on the cable news channels during prime time on a Thursday evening, which is, in my memory, up to that point, unprecedented for a congressional hearing. And shortly before, a minute after 8, Chairman Thompson looked at me and my fantastic deputy, Hannah Muldavid, and said, I guess we're going to find out if this is going to work or not. And we opened the door and we walked out, and he banged the gavel, and he went into his opening, which just sort of set the stage for what we were about to hear. And about halfway through his opening, and he was talking about the fact that the former president knew that he had lost the election, knew that there was no credible evidence that the election had been rigged and was tainted by widespread fraud. And behind the chairman on this humongous projection screen, movie theater-sized projection screen, this image of the former Attorney General Bill Barr appeared in our interview room, giving an interview to our investigators. And he said, you know, I looked at everything the president said, and I told him I thought it was bullshit. And everybody in the room kind of went, and I realized at that moment, oh, this is going to work. People are going to hear this. And we went forward, and you know, the chairman gave a tremendous opening. There was an original video that we had put together with new footage that was really, it was deadly silent in the room when that was playing. And then the vice chair spent a half hour or so methodically walking through this, what we described as a 7-part plan to overturn the election that was punctuated with some of the most compelling evidence that we had gathered on video. And, you know, coming back to the sort of multimedia interoperability of all this, I was, of course, scrolling Twitter, and at that point, sort of the pundit class and political journalists and other folks who had been handicapping how well we would do were all sort of in unanimous agreement that, you know, this is a groundbreaking presentation. And all of our detractors who had promised, you know, rapid response, pointing out all of our flaws, they suddenly went very silent. So in that first hearing, I think we knew that we were doing what we set out to do, and that evening, somewhere along the lines of 21 million Americans tuned in. And for the next month and a half, we kept refining that process. We kept getting better at it. We kept finding different ways to use the digital content that we had produced for the hearing and then use it in different platforms. And a journalist described it to me, and I've stolen this and sort of made it my own. They were the first hearings designed for the streaming age. That, you know, we would have a 90-second video that showed 4 different witnesses talking about one particular part of the story. And then we would be able to use that on our social media platforms. And then the cable news networks and the news networks would use it too, and they'd replay it over and over again. So if you weren't one of the millions of people who was tuning in to watch the hearings, then you would hopefully be one of the millions of people who saw it wherever you do get your news. For June and July of 2022, we kept telling that story in different segments.
You talked about that moment with the chairman before the first hearing and the uncertainty that I think a lot of people felt about what was going to unfold. I remember very vividly in that first hearing looking out from behind the members at this packed room and seeing in the very front row the 4 law enforcement officers who had testified at the hearing the summer before, and then realizing over the course of the hearing that you could gauge very well, how different aspects of what the committee was saying was being received, at least by them, and that was very, very important. And they came to every single proceeding. We had every single hearing.
They did, and a lot of members did too, who themselves were
yes.
trapped in the galleries around the hall of the House that day.
Do you have any particularly vivid memories from any one of that series of 8 hearings?
I have a lot of very vivid memories. Some great, some not so great. But what you mentioned about the officers, I do remember very early on, I think in that first hearing, one of the members or one of the officers having a tear roll down his cheek, and 16 still photographers flooded around him and started taking this picture, and I kind of remember moving around and like, leave the guy alone. But being in the hearing room was an interesting experience because you were hearing the reactions of the press who were covering it and people who were very, very close to the Capitol. One kind of funny moment that pops to mind is I think during the final hearing, which was on or about July 23rd, which dealt with what we call the 187 minutes, which was the duration of time after the security perimeter of the Capitol had been breached until when the former president released his video instructing his supporters to leave the Capitol. There was a video that a member of our production team had sort of brilliantly put together that isolated one particular senator who earlier in the day had sort of been pumping his fist in solidarity with the protesters, isolated him sprinting from the Senate floor when things got a little too hot. And I don't think I heard sort of any more uproarious laughter in the room than then. But there are so many moments, and there were so many compelling witnesses. Again, sort of the second part of this 3-narrator version, the witnesses who themselves appeared, and they were the individuals who took the courageous stand to stop the attack on our democracy, stop the scheme to overturn the election. We talk about our institutions withstanding the assault that happened. Well, those institutions ultimately come down to the women and the men who are working in those jobs and had the courage to say no. And most of our witnesses, of course, by the way, were Republicans, but we had the former Speaker of the Arizona House of Representatives, Rusty Bowers, who gave us pages from his diary in which he had written about reflecting in private prayer after he was the target of this pressure campaign to violate his oath and overturn the Arizona, the results of the election in Arizona. And then being asked by Chairman Adam Schiff what he was thinking that day. We had Shay Moss, the election worker from Georgia who testified, and on video the testimony of her mother, Ruby Freeman, about what it feels like to be someone who's working to help their community as an election worker being personally targeted by the President of the United States. These incredibly powerful moments And of course, the hearing that we put together very, very quickly with a former White House staffer named Cassidy Hutchinson, who was Mark Meadows' assistant, who, after appearing before the Select Committee as a witness in numerous installments of a deposition, came forward to correct her own record because she felt she had been manipulated and pressured by her lawyer who was paid for from the Trump orbit, and then coming forward with incredible courage in front of a national audience to set that record straight. I could go on and on, but if you went through each hearing, every single hearing had a moment. The second one, which is a little more comical, we had a witness who was due to appear, who was on his way down from New Jersey, whose wife went into labor, he had to turn around and go back to New Jersey. But we were able to still get that hearing going.
It wasn't really comical at the time.
It wasn't
for the staff
comical at
preparing
the
for the
time.
hearing.
It's comical in hindsight. But we were still able to do that hearing, which is a reflection of the skill of our team, being able to pull together video of his deposition, even though he wasn't there to testify in person. But every hearing, I think you would probably agree, had its standout moment, whether it was in the hearing room or in the preparation or afterward.
Absolutely.
But in some substance, we got through that month and a half, and it was clear that we had done what we set out to do.
So let me shift gears a little bit and talk about some of the other work you've done in government. You were communications director for the House Foreign Affairs Committee. That committee reviews a very different set of issues than what the Select Committee was looking at. You were a speechwriter for 2 different secretaries of state. Are there common threads between all of these government jobs in terms of communications challenges that you faced?
There are certainly common threads, I think, in any communications-related role, where you realize that the end result of your work is something that's going to be out there for consumption and scrutiny and fact-checking. And when you make mistakes in the communications realm, those mistakes are, you're rarely able to sweep them under the rug and get away with them. And we could have another hour-long session on things that I've screwed up in the past, but I won't bore people with it. But the common thread is that when you are working for a principal, whether it's a member of Congress, whether it's a senator, whether it's a secretary of state, whether it's an ambassador, the stakes are very, very high to make sure that your work can withstand that scrutiny. And the process of making sure your work can withstand that scrutiny differs in every office. If you work for a member of Congress, that member of Congress is accountable to his or her constituents. As a communications person, you need to make sure that what you're saying or doing on behalf of that member of Congress is done in a way that's going to withstand the scrutiny of his or her constituents, that's targeted to that audience about what that person is doing. At the State Department, if you work for a principal, and that principal goes out and says something out loud, well, suddenly that's U.S. foreign policy. So preparing something for a Secretary of State or an ambassador or an Assistant Secretary of State to say goes through a much more rigorous process to make sure that it's going to withstand that scrutiny. So every job is a little different. You know, when you work for a member of Congress in a personal office, you may have one other person who works for you, and so you're starting from a blank piece of paper to write a press release or a statement or a newsletter or whatever it is. In the Select Committee, I had a big team, and I was spending a lot of time sort of as a manager working with Kristen in an advisory role to our members, trying to lay out strategically what I thought we needed to do and then overseeing the team doing it. But at the end of the day, communications can be a real high wire act because that's the work that's made public. That's what people are going to read and consume. And a former boss of mine told me, "You're going to make mistakes. It happens. Better not make the same mistake twice, though, because then you're not paying close enough attention. You're not taking the care that you need to take as a communicator."
And How about takeaways from your government experience that you might apply in your private sector work?
Well, I think a lot of the same skills apply across the board, and my work now, I think a lot of the sort of the work I'm involved in is people who think they might end up getting called before Congress, and what's the playbook that we use to do that? Because that's rife with potential pitfalls. That if you're the subject of a congressional investigation, it's not the same as being subject of investigation from a district attorney's office or the Justice Department office. The motives could be very different. Obviously, we see a lot of politicized use of oversight authority and investigative authority from the Congress, and we see hearings that are not designed to be good faith fact-finding efforts. They're there to advance a political agenda. And if you're a witness in a hearing room like that, that's the way you need to think about it, and that's the way you need to prepare. It's using the skills and the background that I would use to prepare a member for a hearing and say, okay, here's how we're going to use your 5 minutes to ask questions, and instead turning around and saying, here's how this member is going to use his or her 5 minutes to ask questions. Let's get ready for it.
Speaking of 5 minutes to ask questions, I'm seeing that we are running close to the end of this session, and I know that there may be questions in the audience. We want to make sure we have an opportunity for people to ask. So we're happy to answer any questions that you might have. Well, we can keep talking.
We can just keep chatting. Yeah.
High points and low points of the January 6th committee investigation in terms of your communications work.
Well, I think the high points are certainly when we launched our series of hearings in June and July of 2022 and sort of came out of the other side mostly in one piece, having done what we wanted to do. And I think the conclusion of the Select Committee's work, as we say, we were really able to tie a bow around what we had done. The Select Committee's final report is, in my mind, a remarkable document that lays out in explicit detail the case that we had made about what caused the violence of January 6th. And if you page through it, there are as many pages of footnotes as there are of text. It is exhaustively sourced, and virtually every source points to a piece of evidence that the Select Committee gathered, a witness that they talked to, a document that was turned over. And we were able to get that out. We knew the clock was running out, of course, in the 2022 elections. The House of Representatives narrowly flipped to Republican control. So we were wrapping up our work, but in addition to releasing the final report, something that I think is really remarkable that the Select Committee did, was released virtually all of its evidence, all of the materials that it gathered. So virtually every transcript of every interview and deposition, now I believe that universe is complete, because the few that had been held back for further review are now, I believe, public. Piles and piles of documents that we had received from witnesses, all of the video exhibits that we used during the hearings, that was all made public, which committees are not under any obligation to do. But I think our members really believed that it was important to be transparent in what the committee had learned, and they were utterly unafraid to stand behind the committee's conclusions and say, if you have any doubt in your mind about what we found, spend a weekend and look through these files and see for yourself. And if you're a witness who said, oh, the Select Committee, they took me out of context, they only used this one quote, go read the transcript yourself. And I don't think there's a single claim that the Select Committee made about its findings that is not fully backed up by that body of evidence we made public. So I'm very proud that the Select Committee did that. Oh, low points. I screwed something up very badly. At the end of 2021, I made a document public that included a period where there should have been an ellipsis, and it turned into a shouting match in the right-wing media that we were doctoring records, and I had to put out a statement taking blame and apologizing, and it was, just one of those things. But it was a good reminder in a lot of ways, just the level of scrutiny we were under. And coming back to talking about when you're in communications, really there's no mistake that's going to be a small mistake. And it gave us an opportunity to take stock of, okay, what are our procedures here? How are we dealing with this material? How are we handling it? How are we quality controlling it? How are we fact checking everything to make sure something like this doesn't happen again? So it was bad, but it was a learning experience at the same time. And one that by the time we got to the hearings, we had sort of said, okay, here's how we're going to deal with these materials. Here's how we're going to make sure we have enough sets of eyes on them to make sure that that kind of sloppy mistake doesn't happen.
Yes.
I think there's a microphone coming around.
I'm not sure that this isn't a question that you've already answered and I just didn't get it, but I'm still amazed that you two could start this job a week before you had to produce this stuff. And somehow, I still don't understand how you did it. I mean, there must be a great deal of experience that you brought to this task so that you knew what had to be done before you ever took the job. But I'm still sitting here trying to understand if someone threw that mess at me and then I was supposed to come out with this fabulous story and moving picture, and I mean, I watched all the hearings and it was just as compelling as it could possibly be. So I haven't gotten yet how you did it. I mean, you've talked about you've done it, but maybe I'm the only one who missed that. But what is it that made you know what to do a week before, and then it comes out with this seamless whole?
I have thoughts. You want to go first?
I'll just go first and say, first of all, thank you for your kind words about the investigation. And, I think with the first hearing that we were describing, we were very short on staff, and it was a different kind of scramble than what we faced with the other scrambles that had different natures for the other 8 hearings. But with the first hearing and with every hearing the next summer, it was a huge team effort. I mean, we just had, with the first hearing, there was staff and there were members on the Hill who cared about this issue. And there was a great team, Tim and others who came on with me. The skeletal staff worked very closely with a very enthusiastic group of people, and we just made it happen. And then by the time we got to the summer of 2022, we had built this fantastic staff. And beyond that, people did work 24/7. I mean, it really was a sprint pretty much the whole way through. But there was a very talented group of people working together.
Yeah, that's exactly what my thought is. And in the initial one where we didn't have a staff, it was an all hands on deck effort from wherever there were members and committees who could lend some talent. And overall, I think what it points to is we had first of all, we had terrific members on the select committee. We had 9 members who were deeply involved in everything the select committee did on a daily basis. But on Capitol Hill in Congress, there is this unheralded army of incredibly talented public servants who throw themselves into this work for committees and for members who are overworked and underpaid, but are just absolutely driven in their commitment to serving the country, to serving their communities, to serving the members that they work for, who, in the instance of the first hearing, were only too happy to come in and make sure that we had the resources we needed to get it done. And as we built the staff of the select committee, people who walked away from really prestigious jobs in the private sector or elsewhere in government, and were happy to jump on board for what they knew was going to be an 18-month slog to get the work done. Just an absolute testament to the integrity and the commitment of the people that Chris and I were lucky enough to work with for so long. That just a brilliantly talented team. And through some of what we did, I like to think, we kind of broadened the horizons of, you know, what are some of the ways that you can be a public servant? What are some of the ways you can work for Congress? You know, we typically don't hire video editors and producers who are there in a suite of offices working on digital content alongside investigators and lawyers. But it really was this group of diverse talent from a variety of fields who, hearing the call to service for this particular investigation, were there and worked, as Kristen said, 24 hours a day to make sure that we were able to present our findings the way we wanted to.
And just to amplify the reference Tim made to the members of the committee themselves putting in time, it really was inspiring to work for this group of 9 members, because they, I think, were an example of how the democratic process should work as they were doing an investigation of efforts to undermine the democratic process. And it was a membership that spanned all parts of the political spectrum. But they were focused and serious and collaborative in the way you want to see members of Congress work together. And they did put in a huge amount of time.
Okay, it's working. Hi, I actually am from Mississippi and was fortunate enough to work for Congressman Thompson this past summer, so it's awesome that you're here. I was just wondering how you think the personalities or like political stature of the members sort of informed or helped or even hurt the communication side of what the committee was doing.
Oh, you know, the personalities of the members are going to be an important part of what drives the committee's work and what the what the final product of the committee is ultimately going to look like. I will single out Chairman Thompson as chairman just to sort of, in my mind, characterize how I view him as a chairman. That he was a remarkable consensus builder, and he was committed to bringing the members together to make sure that when the committee spoke, it spoke in a unified way. And you know, I think that was always the case. For a communicator, my job is to, as a staffer who's a communicator, my job is to give my boss or my bosses my best advice and say, here's the strategy that I think is going to reach the audience we want to reach and make the impact we want to make. And the members make their decisions, and they tell me, here's what we're going to do, and then my job is then to go do it. And you know, that is one of the, in my mind, core parts of being a staff member for an elected principal is they have the trust of their constituents, they have their votes, they have the office that the Constitution prescribes, and we're there to do their work, and it's an honor to be able to do that. I don't think any staff member for any member of Congress or senator or elected or confirmed official is ever going to agree with their boss 100%. I think that's part of life, and part of being a staffer is saying to yourself, when I've got my work hat on, my job is to give my boss the best advice I can, even if I think my boss might not be right, and when my boss makes a decision, do the job. So that's generally how I viewed it. Do I think in hindsight that anything the committee members told me to do hurt our communications efforts? No, I don't. We weren't perfect, but again, maybe that's because I screwed something up. But overall, I think that we fulfilled our aims. You may have thoughts on this, also having spent a long time on the Hill.
Couldn't have said it better than how you just said it.
think there was another up here.
Yeah, thank you. You know, when I saw the proceedings when they were happening, it was really, really quite compelling. And anybody who saw it, I think, was extraordinarily impressed with what they were seeing, whether they agreed with it or it wasn't saying what they wanted to. As a communications expert, though, as time goes on, people tend to forget. Other things pop up in the news and whatever. This was such an important thing. How do you keep it relevant as time moves on?
It's an excellent question, and I think part of what we did, part of what our role was in the Select Committee was to build a permanent record that will be there for people to go back to. And it's important that there be reminders to go back, but I'm still involved in political conversations in Washington and so on and so forth. And I feel like once every couple of weeks, I have an opportunity to talk to a journalist or to go on Twitter and say, in case you've forgotten, Senator I saw on TV saying he didn't think that Vice President Pence was ever in that much danger. In case you've forgotten, here's a 90-second video that the Select Committee put together showing just how close Vice President Pence was to danger. So, I do think it takes a committed core of people who refuse to let this fade from memory. I think we have a lot of great public servants who are out there now making the case that we shouldn't forget what January 6th was and who was responsible for it. Courageous voices who, have defied the conventional, who have defied the litmus test of their own political party. But for the Select Committee's part, I like to think that the record we left behind will always be something that people can go back to remind themselves, and not just paging through a 700-page volume to remind them, but using the tools that we used in the Select Committee hearing, using the tools that people use now to get their news and information. And I try to remind my friends in the press, my friends in politics of that all the time. But it's a challenge. It's certainly a challenge. I think it's the same challenge we faced at the beginning of the Select Committee's work, that even after 6 months, these sort of phony mythologies around it had grown up. But, something that Chairman Thompson talked about in his foreword and that he mentioned during the Select Committee's work is as the wheels of justice move forward in terms of legal accountability for January 6th, broader accountability for January 6th ultimately rests with the American people. And that we get to choose who holds the reins of powers in this country. And if there's one thing that we did beyond fulfilling the mandate of House Resolution 503, which was determine the facts, circumstances, and causes of January 6th, it was to paint a picture of who needs to be held accountable more broadly and who we're going to trust going forward to chart the course for our country. So, I hope we did our part. I want to keep reminding folks of what we did and the legacy that we left behind. But ultimately, it's going to be up to the people who choose our leaders to remember what January 6th was and hold those accountable who need to be held accountable.
Sorry, I just wanted to know the long-term effects of the Select Committee. Very impressive work. You alluded to the 22 election a bit. I was wondering if you thought that maybe the committee's findings were relevant for that one. Maybe, again, there was a predicted wet red wave there, and it sort of didn't happen. But then going forward for 24, and there's polls are extremely close. There's talk of pardoning many members, many people were involved in that whole thing. So I just wondered about your thoughts going into this presidential election and elections more generally.
Well, I will say, as someone who's watched a lot of elections over the years, that after 2022, when sort of the predicted red wave didn't materialize, it was interesting to see concern about democracy being something that was on voters' minds. as we look toward this year, I saw some research recently done by this organization called Democracy First that polled voters researched voters in the swing states about what their chief concerns were going into 2024. And the research essentially said that anyone who wouldn't commit to abiding by the legitimate results of an election, rejecting mis and disinformation, rejecting political violence, that a lot of voters saw that as disqualifying. And I don't know if a lot of the research and polling we're seeing asks that or if it's reflected in that, but it gives me confidence that if people are going to the polls this fall, that fidelity to the Constitution and the rule of law is something that is on voters' minds. So I hope that continues to be a theme that we hear over the next 6 months.
I think we've come to the end of the hour here. I guess I would ask if you might take just another minute or two as we close to offer any words of wisdom you might have for students who might be thinking about going into government or communications.
It's a great question. And when I was wrapping up my time as a student, I was interested in politics. I was interested in government. I thought I would go more into a policy role. I had been interested in foreign policy and communications when I was a student, but I thought I would end up in policy. But I got to Washington, and I came to Washington to research for my master's thesis. I actually didn't plan to stay there, but I ended up getting a job as a junior press staffer in a Senate office, and it was the job I got because it was the job that was there and it was offered it to me. And before long, I realized this sort of suits me better, I think, than the policy world. I think I'm better at this sort of messaging thing. I love writing, the interaction with the media. I like that. So the biggest piece of advice I give for young people who are interested in getting into government, getting into politics, is keep an open mind and consider your career trajectory in politics and policy like you're at the wide end of a cone, and it's going to take a long time to get to the narrow end of the cone. And the first job you're going to get is not going to be your dream job. You're probably going to be way overqualified for it, and nobody's going to be mad if you leave after 18 months, because if you work on the Hill, everybody knows. Go from this office to that office to that office to a cabinet agency, you come back, and over time you realize what you like and what you're good at, and what really keeps you compelled to do it. Because government service, public service is not an easy path to choose. Like I said earlier, it's not a glamorous life, and it's gotten a little more accessible, which is great news. When I started on the Hill, internships were uniformly unpaid, which made it very, very difficult for a lot of people who would have loved to get involved to have that opportunity to do so, just because there was no money. You couldn't get paid. My first job on the Hill, fortunately, was a full-time job, so I was able to go down that path. And now internships are now paid on the Hill, which I think has opened the door to a lot more people. But it's still, a difficult career path. But if you've got the bug, it's enormously rewarding. If you're driven to work for the things that you believe in, for the people that you believe in, and you're able to start seeing a tangible difference in where you want to make differences in your community, in your country, there's nothing more rewarding. But you got to keep an open mind, because it took a long, long, long time before I was working on national security-focused communication for the House Foreign Affairs Committee, which turned into oversight and investigation communications after we got into the majority, and I worked on the first impeachment, which then turned into running communications for, I think, the most significant congressional investigation in recent memory. But that's not going to be your first job if you work on the Hill. So keep an open mind, use your networks, talk to people, work hard, and eventually you'll get to that narrow end of the cone.
Thank you for sharing that great advice. Thank you for sharing your time today. It's been a pleasure talking with you.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you.